On today's episode, we're talking to someone who's written a book about food, but it's not a cookbook. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. This is Molly Stevens, and today, Kristen Donnelly and I are going to interview someone we've been wanting to bring on the show for a long time, Alicia Kennedy. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Molly. So today we're going to talk to Alicia Kennedy. I taught a class about cookbook proposal writing last winter, and probably about 5 of the students in there cited Alicia's work as an inspiration for them. And even though Alicia wrote a book called No Meat Required that does not include recipes, they still want to bring this intellectual rigor and the themes about environmentalism into their cookbooks, their recipe books. Since she does inspire so many cookbook authors and aspiring cookbook authors, that is why I cannot wait to talk to her.
Yeah, no, she's really become a voice. The way she combines so many different factors, cultural and media criticism and just the intersectionality of so many different things. Really academic, as you used the word rigor before. So I think it'd be great to find out about, and the process of making her new book. It's just coming out. Her newsletter is called From the Desk of Alicia Kennedy, and it comes out on Monday and it also comes out on Friday. She's got a podcast. Alicia is from New York, but she lives in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And before she started her newsletter and has become an author, she spent years working as a copy editor, a freelance writer, and her essays and recipes have appeared in too many major publications to even list. And so now she's got this book out, so it's going to be a good one. Well, Alicia Kennedy, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thank you. And congratulations on your new book, No Meat Required.
Oh, thank you.
Well, there's so much we want to talk about today. So much about your story, your backstory. But let's start right off with your book, because a lot of that is in the book, too. So in an essay you wrote recently on your Substack on publishing a book, you talked about this virtual storage unit where for years you've been collecting notes and articles, essays about a world where people didn't eat animals, but still cared deeply about eating good food. Did you know this was going to be a book as you were collecting this storage unit?
Well, I had a sense. I suppose when I started to write about food in 2015, I had this thought in my head about writing a book about radical vegetarian spaces, like around the world. And so I started with a place here in San Juan that it used to exist called El Departamento de la Comida. And my friend Pax was the chef there, and they cooked vegetarian food. Their mission was to flip the script on the statistic that Puerto Rico consumes 80 to 85% imported foods. They were going to flip it and say, we're serving 80% local food and 20% imported food. And I went there a couple of times. It was really fantastic. And that was sort of the jumping off point for me into food writing, I suppose, food and travel writing. But it was also meant to be part of this kind of future vision where I wrote about vegetarian radical spaces. And from there, I got distracted. I wrote about lots of other things, but I had always been focused on doing something down the line that would kind of bring my interest in politics and meatless food together. And so that has kind of ended up being the book. Obviously, life has changed since 2015, and lots of things have changed since 2015. And so, the book is very different than what I maybe first envisioned it as, but I think it's still, the book I was kind of working toward for so long.
Yeah, and you talked about working on the proposal for about 2 years.
Oh, yeah. It was very start and stop. I would work on it, but, because it's unpaid work, and I am a freelancer. I've been a freelancer forever. I've had like anchor gigs and everything. And so it's not like but at the same time, it's like, when do you ever have a few weeks, a couple of months to just focus on one thing? Like I personally have never had that, even after I sold the book. And so it was in fits and starts. And then there was a point in 2019 where I was like, I just have to finish this freaking thing. And, my agent had started to email me like every couple of months to check in. So I was like, okay, like it's time to finish it. But I needed that push from my agent to finish it. And it also really helped that at the time I had met my now husband and we were dating and he was bartending. So I had like every night by myself. And that was when I finished it.
So that
makes sense. No distraction.
You were working with Jenny. Your agent is Jenny Stevens.
Yes.
How did you connect with her, and at what point in the process was she part of this?
Actually, I connected with her way before I started even working on this book proposal. We had worked on another book proposal that was more memoir. She had emailed me. I had written a piece for Hazlitt about eating oysters after a big loss in my life. And that was when agents started reaching out to me, which felt a bit odd, honestly. But when Jenny emailed me, she was able to say nice things about my work broadly and not just be like, let's write a cookbook about grief. And so I was like...
So I was odd because it was this really terrible thing.
Yes.
And that's when you get the attention.
Exactly. It was very bizarre. I mean, it makes sense in a capitalistic way, I suppose, where it was like, oh, we can turn this sadness into money, maybe. And I'm like,
we can commercialize this.
We can make something happen here.
Right.
And so, but Jenny, when she emailed me, it wasn't about that specifically. It was like, she saw a lot of things in my writing that I was hoping people would see. And so that was really important to me. But we worked on a different proposal that went out, and I didn't have like the following that I have now. So people were like, what's the arc? What's the blah, blah, blah? Like the writing is nice, but I don't think we can sell this. And so that didn't sell. Then I was like, we figured out that the next thing would be I focus in on my vegan knowledge and write a proposal around that. And so this was the second proposal, but it was also like proposal 2.5 because it was like another version still of the first proposal that I sent out on this topic. The funny thing is, I wrote the proposal about the book I wanted to write, which was like the cultural and political history of vegan and vegetarian foods since Diet for a Small Planet, which sounds like, whenever I say that, it sounds like way too academic, and the book is not at all academic. But then that didn't really sell. So then I kind of took more of a tech meat angle, like, okay, like, what does it mean that we're talking about Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat now? And that was the version that got some interest. What I ended up writing was the book I wanted to write in the first place. So that was good.
with some tech meat.
It comes through it because I think I like write about it with such disdain that I think I forget that I wrote about it.
Right. But it's that was what was in the news. That was what people were talking about, was lab meat, tech meat. And so you had to put that into the proposal to get it
to sell.
You ended up at Beacon Press, which really seems like such a good fit for this book. I was just looking at their website, and they say right up front that they're publishing books that, quote, change the way readers think about fundamental issues. And it's very clear that this book is written to change people's minds or to, inform them, certainly. And so how'd you end up at Beacon?
So the book sold at auction in the end, but for, not a huge amount of money. And so, but Beacon I decided on over the other press because they just have this history. Also, they're distributed by Penguin Random House. So I figured I'd have better reach with them. Yeah. And I also, I wanted to be part of that history. The name I always come up with, because I minored in philosophy, was Herbert Marcuse. It's like they published The One-Dimensional Man. But like, I don't think Frankfurt School Theory is like why people are going to read my book. But they also have published James Baldwin and they have like a really great history, and they keep books in print. And so their reach into academia is also a huge boost for this book, because there are certainly chapters that can be used in classes on American studies and cultural studies. So they just hit a lot of good notes for me in terms of the press to go with.
That is smart to think about distribution.
And also you're thinking about different markets for this book, because I don't want to say it's a hard book to describe, because it's not, but I learned so much reading it too, because there's just this history, and there's not a book that really puts this plant-based eating together, like puts it into a cultural and historical perspective. The book covers so much ground. Your upbringing, your personal dining, interviews, you analyze cookbooks throughout, the past few decades. There's cultural history, and we talk about climate change, food justice. You talk about the wellness culture. I mean, there's a lot packed in here. So it's pretty massive, but somehow you've done it in 170 pages or so. So I was really curious, did you have that length in mind?
I thought it would be longer, but I think throughout the process, I was really conscious of the fact that people were going to feel antagonized by the book in general, because people feel antagonized by vegetarian food and vegan food and like have this initial reaction of like, I don't want that. That's not my thing. Like, unless they're going for it. And so I felt like by keeping it short, it would be a better way to not convert people, but like get someone who might be hesitant to read about this subject to read about it, And what I really wanted to do is simply to kind of start, because there are a lot of books about vegetarian history, but there's not a lot of books that focus on the food specifically. And for me, and I think that this is very apparent in the book, like I never would have been able to stop eating meat if I didn't like the food that I was eating. And that was for me the most important thing. And I think for a lot of people, that's the most important thing, is to continue to eat good food that satisfies you on multiple levels. So, I wanted that to come through, and I wanted, to change people's perspectives on what this food really means and its place in the culture. Like, there's obviously, a commune, I talk a lot about the farm commune in Tennessee and their role in this. I talk a lot about anarchism as the roots of a lot of vegan cookbooks, but also kind of vegan cheese and these ideas. And like, but I think I try and do it in a way that like really centers the food and also really centers how fun and interesting it can be to kind of dive into these subcultures that a lot of people don't think about very much. It's been interesting to be interviewed, by people a lot younger than me, not a lot younger, but let's say Gen Z, because I'm an elder millennial. They have like no context for zines. Like their zines were YouTube. And so like to be able to kind of bridge the gaps between like how different generations kind of related to this food and also how different subcultures related to this food, I wanted that to be like really fun and inviting and invigorating and not like a slog to work through, because I'm someone who will read The Bloodless Revolution, which is like 600, 700 pages, but like not a lot of people are going to do that.
Yeah, we were talking about how much you read in general and how much you read for this book. So you did that work for us and synthesized it.
Yeah.
And the organization, did you know how you wanted to organize it?
I think I wanted to get the chapter about meat out of the way. Because like I say in the introduction that I don't care about meat because, well, I wanted to make that statement like very clearly just because I just wanted to make it. I wanted to write the book from an extremely vegetarian perspective, like, and just to make the omnivore feel like the outsider. That was kind of the vibe of how I wanted to write the book. Not because, again, I really want to invite people in and I don't want to alienate people, but at the same time, I think that that's a useful exercise for people, is to be put in the place where the way that they eat is the stranger way of eating, because I think it helps understand the framing more of why people stop eating meat or stop eating dairy, etc. But the structure was something I built from the proposal, obviously, in the table of contents. And honestly, when I started to write, eventually I downloaded Scrivener because I had to organize myself. And I just went back to my proposal and was like, okay, these are the chapters I thought about. And then I think I reorganized them a little bit, because once I was able to see them and once I was able to kind of feel the flow of the book, but I wanted to bring people back to 1971, of course, in the first chapter, to Diet for a Small Planet. Then I wanted to be like, this is why we're so weird about meat in the US. And then I wanted to be like, okay, and here's all the people who have done something different, to kind of like make it comfortable. And then I think the introduction is very long for a nonfiction book. It probably could have been shorter, but I also wanted to like really name the stakes and also give context for my own history and my own eating, because for me, it's really difficult to get into a food book, any food book about anything, and not really understand where that person is coming from, the author, when, I need to know how they eat and why.
Yeah, it's interesting. The chapters, and I think the chapter titles are great too. They have there's a real balance to them in terms of length. And I know, because I read it. I had a certain amount of time to read it before talking to you. And so I was like, okay, I was like, they're very discreet, each chapter, and each chapter really takes you to, and you could, I feel like you could pull out a lot of the chapters and read them almost independently without losing too much.
Yeah.
Yeah, like standalone essays. I mean, like a lot of your work.
Yeah. I can't help but be an essayist.
It's who you are. Yes. I was wondering how you decided to approach citations.
Well, it's funny because I went into this process being like, I'm going to be the best at citations. I'm going to like, from day one, I am going to like make all the notations. It's going to be in the same format. Everything is going to be perfect. And then like, obviously that went out the window like immediately. And by the end of it, I had to like go back and do all the citations. But that's useful because then you get updated information and everything like that. The bibliography was more interesting to me because I was like, there's a lot of books that I know I cited in the book, of course, they're named, but there's so much that informed my thinking that I was like, I'm just going to make it as long as possible. I'm going to pull every book off of my shelves that I maybe referenced or maybe thought of while I was writing this book, because I also wanted the bibliography to be, a jumping off point for anyone else who wanted to think about these things. Mm-hmm. A lot of the citations, though, they're either my interviews or like past pieces I've written, or they are books. So it's pretty simple. But at the same time, there's also a lot of data like IPCC reports and the most updated things on like how much meat people eat in the US, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it's interesting because I do know like so much of it is going to be, different when it comes out. But for the moment that it was written, it was like, we really did try and keep it up to date as it went into production until the last moment in terms of those numbers. But it is really, it's really interesting to work through the citations because there are a lot of citations. I've noticed that like reading other people's nonfiction books that are coming out recently about food, and I'm like, oh, like mine has like a number, like every paragraph has like 2 citations.
Did you ever think about having them footnotes being throughout, or always think there'd be endnotes?
I really didn't want to do footnotes. I didn't want to be distracted. I could do footnotes. I feel like that would be... But I also feel like if I started doing footnotes, I'd get into David Foster Wallace territory very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Footnotes with some commentary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the trim size isn't, I'm not sure if I know the trim size because I'm looking at a PDF, but there's also that to consider, how much.
Right. It's a small book.
Yeah. So let's talk about the cover.
Yes.
You've written about the cover somewhere and I don't have that, but it's so bright and lemony and kind of wonderful.
Yeah, my inspiration for the cover were 2 paintings. Manoucher Yektai, his painting Tomato Plant from 1959. He's an Iranian-American artist, a founding member of the New York School. So I read a lot of art magazines, and I just saw this painting and I was like, this is it. This is what I want the feeling of the cover to be, which was very heavy strokes, not photorealistic. And I wanted a lot of texture. And so that tomato plant plus a Picasso tomato plant, I sent as inspiration, and what they came back with was immediately exactly what I wanted. So that worked out well.
Good for everybody.
You said you read a lot of art magazines. You read a lot. We established that. But from a process point of view as a writer, how do you track all of this?
So it's really interesting. So someone I know was talking about a self-help book, like a business or productivity self-help book called like The Second Brain, which is like that you dump everything into a document or something, and then you can go back to it. Like if you read, and it was funny because I decided to maybe this would help me. So I watched a YouTube video about it, and it was like, creative people do this naturally. And so I was like, yes, I'm not learning anything from this idea. Like I literally, that's all I do is dump information from my brain into other places. And then either I go back to it or not. Like for me, writing down notes is how I kind of internalize information. I write by hand a lot. And a lot of the things I write, I start writing by hand and using my notes app on my phone. Like when I'm walking, when I'm listening to a podcast, when I'm walking the dog, I'll stop and just write something in my notes app if I have an idea. And so I'm just a big dumper of information. But also because I have this newsletter that I send out every week, a lot of my work is so immediate So, and I like that because I can also go back to it and take from it for longer form projects or something like that and make it better. But at the same time, I'm kind of always in a conversation with myself, but with other people as well about whatever it is I'm thinking about. So between social media and the newsletter, I feel like I'm constantly in a kind of processing moment in terms of
iterative
information. Yeah.
But I'm just imagining all these notebooks everywhere because like in the book, you'll talk about, like you describe a meal you had at, I think it's Bloodroot. And
yes,
8 years ago or something. And you describe it in such vivid detail. And it was a really wonderful meal. And so it's like just really tempting detail. And I'm like, and you weren't writing the book at that process.
No, I was writing about that experience though.
Right. That's right. That was for an article. So you were processing it. Yeah. So you just sort of keep these notes in various places.
I also have pictures of like everything I've eaten for the last 10 years on my phone.
Yeah.
So
helpful. Yeah.
I can call things up.
Was Scrivener helpful for keeping track or did you just use that for writing?
I just used it for writing. I really need Scrivener. I'm starting a new book proposal. So when I'm starting a longer project that has multiple parts, I really, really need it. And I was saying this to someone yesterday. I was saying this is someone who's trying to finish college and can't finish. And I was like, have you tried making a list? But like Scrivener for me is kind of like, it basically produces a list of what I need to figure out. And so like, okay, I have the overview. I need to do the table of contents. I have my bio. But so like that really is helpful for me to break it down because, if you think about especially a book project, but even a book proposal as like one big heap of thing you have to kind of slog through.
One big mess.
It's like so difficult.
Yeah.
So I'm like a big list maker and Scrivener helps kind of just do a list for me as well.
Yeah. You check things off the list and
and break it into little chunks.
Yeah. You do talk about, it's so interesting reading the book and also reading your newsletter. There's like a lot of these questions you've answered or addressed them, but you wrote, writing the book was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, was your quote.
Yeah.
And, what were the elements that made it so hard or challenging? And what surprised you the most about writing a book?
It was really hard because I think the pandemic compounded it. I sold it in June of 2020, which I think was a moment when we still didn't really know what the next year and a half, 2 years would be like. So writing it while I didn't really know what the world would look like on the other side of this, having to self-motivate myself through a book project versus, 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 word pieces was very difficult. Like I'm used to having obviously very short deadlines and like really immediate feedback on everything. And so that was really challenging. Motivating myself to write the book while also having to write to make a living was really challenging. So it was just a lot of things. My hair fell out at the end of the process. Like not all of it, but a lot of it. And so it was just a very, I think when I finally handed in the first draft, my body was just like a little catatonic to some extent. And it was just because I think it was doing something I'd always wanted to do, but having it be in kind of the worst possible circumstances was a little bit like, I didn't get to enjoy it, I think, as I wanted to. I didn't get to travel and research as I wanted to, or as I envisioned myself doing. So, it ended up being a very lonely process, but I think kind of the book works for that because it's really a book about someone looking at the past of who she's been and what she's eaten, but also digging into the cookbooks and digging into the histories and trying to carve something out of something that means something out of 10 years of eating in a way that's considered a little bit strange.
And you're working on another proposal after all that. But
yes,
you feel like, I know you can't predict, but do you think it'll be more satisfying of a process?
Well, the thing I take away from writing this book is that I will not do another book unless it's a process I will enjoy.
Ah,
yes.
Awesome.
That's what I've learned.
That's what I'm always telling people. You have to find a way to love the process.
Yeah.
Well, I also think it was just what I've read and that the stakes were so high for this book too. The first book, it often, I think there's so much pressure on that for all the reasons.
Yes. No, I put a lot of pressure on myself. Yeah.
How was the editing process?
It wasn't heavily edited. It's really, I think if you read it, it's very much a lot like reading my newsletters every week.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so if you would like a long form version of the newsletter, this is the book for you. The copy editing process was really fun for me, actually, because I used to be a copy editor. So that's kind of what I love. I love nitty gritty, like silly things, silly to other people. And so that was a process that was really fun. The editing, my second draft, I don't think was that much different from my first draft. There were a few places where I had to smooth myself out, et cetera. But I think in the copy editing, we really dug into where I was making sense and where I wasn't. And so that was really a useful process.
Yeah. But there weren't any wholesale changes.
No.
Interesting. Yeah.
And having all that experience as a copy editor, a lot of it was at New York Magazine, right? And so you learned to edit in this particular voice, perhaps. How, over the years, have you developed your own voice?
I don't know. I think I think it's interesting to me that I write about food because I do read a lot about food, but I don't read exclusively about food, obviously. Like I read so much. I don't think anyone who writes about food reads exclusively about food, but I read so many art magazines.
Maybe nobody writes about food reads exclusively.
But I read a lot of just fiction. I read a lot of theory. I read a lot of art writing, poetry. Like I read everything. And so I always want to kind of level up the sentences. And so I think that having been a copy editor, of course, having come up at New York Magazine, also having been at the Village Voice, towards the end of its life, that certainly influences my voice. Like I definitely am a little bit trying to make people laugh a little bit, even when I'm in the middle of something kind of serious, or giving kind of an irreverent aside to a moment that might otherwise be serious. That's definitely in me, and I don't think I could take that away. But I wouldn't want to.
No, it's an important part of this. We had a good laugh over that would be a bummer comment about food writing about
just like food media. Yeah, that would be a bummer. Definitely sat through many a editorial meeting where that was the unsaid.
Yes.
I think it was when you were talking to Jenny Dorsey. I think it was on your podcast, and you talked about the value of writing for other publications and being, edited by other, and how important that is for development as a writer. And now you are right. I mean, obviously your newsletter is primary focus, but you still write for other publications. And I'm just wondering now, do you find you're able to write in Alicia Kennedy voice and not so much have to morph into their house style?
A little bit more, for sure. I do know some people I'm jealous of. I love Rachel Connolly. She's an Irish author, and she has this fiction book coming out. And I think when she writes for the New York Times style section, she's fully Rachel Connolly, and she's allowed to do that. Mm-hmm. And I'm I could never get away with that. And so, but I definitely am allowed a little bit more voice. I hope that if my I'm doing air quotes, my success as a food writer, if it does anything, I hope is kind of galvanize younger or just other food writers to be more different in their approach. Because I don't think it's very useful to have Alicia Kennedy says things that other people don't say, and that's her thing. I would like there to be kind of a groundswell of people doing a little bit more media criticism, tying together the cultural, the ecological, the political when it comes to food, because I think that a lot of people think that way. I just think we feel like we're not allowed to do it. So writing for other publications and for my newsletter, it's really a big balance, but I do still love writing for other people because it still allows me to learn things. It allows me to learn my bad tendencies that I allow myself to continue in the newsletter.
Like what? Do you have any
I don't
examples?
know. I edit myself a lot, honestly. Because I have a long lead time on my self-imposed editorial calendar.
Oh, yes. I want to ask about that.
I'll write something and I'll go back a lot, and I'll take out things where I think I'm just being... My bad tendencies are to be petty, vengeful, and so I'm okay, let's take out these things. These aren't actually serving the audience. These are you kind of doing therapy or clearing your throat. Let's get that out of the way. And so obviously when I write for a publication, I ideally don't do that at all. But I also love getting to play in other voices and other registers. I think that that's really useful as a skill. You learn things about that. I think that what hurts writing, I think, about right now, when we have so few outlets for writers, and especially for new and emerging writers, and we have so much less leeway for editing and time for editing for younger writers, is, a lot of people think that they can just create content and like put out a newsletter and like that'll be the thing. And it's like, but there's so much work that has to go on to get to the place where that's going to be anything worthwhile. And like, that sounds kind of mean, I guess, but at the same time, like that background work has to be done. What's the problem is that we have fewer and fewer places for people to do it. So I love any opportunity I get to write for other people is still really useful.
Yeah. Are you pitching now, or editors come to you, or is it a mix?
It's a mix. I hadn't pitched for a while, but right now I'm pitching again. I'm like, I got to get back in the swing of it. I do think editors are nicer to me now. They're too nice.
Oh, gosh.
Well, yeah, but you can use that. I mean, that's okay. That's okay.
Yes,
You've earned
yes.
it. You've worked for it. And, it's interesting. It's so interesting what you're saying about not enough places for new and emerging writers and having to do the work to get yeah. Well, let's talk about the newsletter a little bit. I mean, it seems that you were an early adopter to Substack, but you also really hit a nerve with it. You have to remind me how long you've been doing it, but when did you, in the process, sort of get the sense that it was really becoming viable, that it was really grabbing?
It's terrible, but it was when Adam Rappaport left Bon Appetit. And that was the moment when people were interested in alternative viewpoints in food media. There were a few pieces that were like, where else can I read about food? And so I was just lucky that I had started my newsletter sort of the beginning of 2020. I kind of hit on my voice and my format in March 2020. And then June 2020, I was out there consistently writing this. And so it was ready to be kind of picked up in the interest in alternative food media. Whetstone was another, platform. Vittles was another place. Like, we all kind of got swept up and kind of benefited, frankly, from that moment. So I was definitely very lucky that I started when I did, because I think starting now, you're coming into such a crowded marketplace. People have their newsletters that they pay for. And we're really seeing, I think right now, sort of a correction in the newsletter marketplace where like people who had subscribed to me, but are more recipe oriented people and less like essayistic or sort of like less food studies oriented, they can find the people now on Substack who are doing more of the recipe-oriented things. Like, they can subscribe to Hetty McKinnon's newsletter, and they can subscribe to other folks and get what they want, so they don't need to kind of subscribe to me anymore. But there's still people who are still finding me and finding my newsletter and who are interested in that angle. So I think it's a really interesting moment because it's become so crowded, but people are kind of like really finding who it is they want to support in this marketplace, which is interesting.
You mentioned, you have this long lead time. So, I mean, yeah, like, what does this process look like? How are you managing your publishing schedule?
Yeah, it's funny. On last weekend, I wrote out everything I had planned, and I realized that I was set up until October in terms of not in terms of like I haven't done the writing, but I know exactly what's coming out from now until October.
And that's a weekly newsletter plus a paid
twice a week.
Twice a week. Yeah.
But what kind of set it off is I decided I wanted to write like a 5-week series on the phrase food is political. So that's a good chunk of my summer. Then the book comes out. So I have to be like, hey, my book is out, and then go on tour. So I could be like, hey, I'm on my book tour. So like, there's a few things that have kind of like buoy me through. But I think that's the cool thing about having a newsletter is I do have that long lead time, but I also have the flexibility to change it when I want to and just kind of write I wrote a travel blog basically when I went to Indiana mostly about eating in airports, but also about the symposium I went to and stuff like that. And so there's room for me to there's wiggle room. But for me, it helps me to have that vision for what is coming because it just helps me to structure my reading and my interviews. Like the series I'm doing on food is political, I'm interviewing Anya von Bremsen about her new book, National Dish, but also probably all of her work. I'm interviewing Dr. Annie Gall, she's in food studies and in Middle Eastern studies. So, I have the lead time to do those interviews, kind of process those interviews and do a lot of the reading and then come out with whatever it is I come out with. But I think it seems very organized. and it is very organized, like in the macro sense. Like in the micro sense, I'm really just a person sitting here reading and taking notes. Like I'm not like, I don't have a grand vision or a grand plan for anything.
But you must have a deadline for yourself. For newsletter comes out on Monday, the essay newsletter comes out on Monday. When do you need your first draft done in order to get it edited? Do you have that, or is it just sometimes you're just sitting there Sunday night?
Never sitting. I used to sit there Sunday night.
Yeah.
Now I don't do that anymore at all. But I'll try and write my first draft Monday, Tuesday for the next week. That way I'm able to kind of come back to it throughout the week and be like, this sucks, or I'll add this, or, and be able to play with it. I'm much looser with my paid subscriber posts. They're kind of like, there is a loose structure of what's going to come out, but whatever they contain is kind of whatever I had the bandwidth for.
I was going to say, because you had your rant on natural wine that kind of interrupted the flow, you said.
It did interrupt it, but it ended up being good.
It worked out.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then teaching. You've talked a lot about like pulling up other writers or, wanting to help other writers. And I imagine teaching is one way.
Yeah, you did the culinary tourism program at BU.
Yes.
Will we see more teaching from you?
Everyone keeps asking me. I don't know. I hope so, that they ask me back to teach again. I do wish to teach. I want to teach food writing for sure, because people definitely assume that I'm teaching writing and not that I'm teaching like a more theoretical type of class. But I would love to teach writing. It was really gratifying for me that with the folks in my class with their final projects, which was basically just, pick a subject and a place in culinary tourism and do a longer piece on that. And a lot of them have been coming to me still to be like, can I talk with you about this or about this idea, because I want to publish it and that sort of thing. And so it's really gratifying to have that kind of relationship with folks. And a lot of them are my peers, generationally, and or even older than I am. And so that's also the cool thing about the gastronomy program at BU is it's really very diverse in terms of especially generation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I do hope you get an opportunity to teach food writing, and one of the reasons we really wanted to have you on to the podcast, besides that you're amazing and wonderful and have a new book out, but that you're a food writer who doesn't necessarily put recipes in their work. You've written a lot about, where recipes fit into food writing, and, do you have to write recipes to be a food writer kind of thing. So I think a lot of people who listen to the podcast, may be figuring out what direction they're going in, and maybe recipes aren't their beat, maybe that they want to write food. So I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know where the question is in it, but it's, as someone who's, spent decades developing recipes, and I'm kind of like, don't want to do that anymore. Actually, if you pay me a lot, I'll still do it. But no, but that there's a certain, there are other ways to engage.
Yes.
Obviously. I think you often cite Nigel Slater as someone whose work you really admire. And doesn't he describe himself as a writer who cooks, or a cook who writes? Which is it?
Yes. Yeah. A writer who cooks.
A writer who cooks,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yes.
I have a friend who calls himself a cook who writes. And I've been thinking a lot about those differences. So
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see myself as a writer who cooks, and I've definitely struggled, especially in the last few months, with the demands of recipe writing and the demands of recipe development on top of the daily labor of cooking. I guess when I've been writing about it, I feel like it comes off maybe to some people as complaining, but what I'm trying to do is be like, I really burned myself out last year trying to write a recipe like every week because that would burn anybody out. But I don't think that readers have this real understanding. I think that a lot of people maybe like came up looking at like the Bon Appetit Test Kitchen or New York Times Cooking, and they think that like recipe development is like this kind of fun magic trick that happens. And, for me personally, it's not that. It can be that, but a lot of the time it's a big struggle. It's a lot of doing dishes. I've had to explain to people like I don't have a dishwasher. Because someone asked me like, can you put the measures in normal American measures and not just grams? I'm like, I don't want to do the dishes, frankly. Like
it's a lot of little cups.
It's a lot of
the measuring cups.
Yeah.
And so like I really struggle with the expectation that because I write about food, I also like owe people a recipe recipe all the time too. And I think that a lot of food writers are struggling with that, especially because social media puts the demand on people to kind of producing inspirational content like literally constantly. So
yeah.
That was a beautiful essay you wrote, though, about recipe writing.
Where recipes come from. And
yeah, and it was funny, like just the idea of a recipe being, was it cooked by the body or written by the body first? And, you know, people are always like, what do you think of ChatGPT recipes? I'm like, they haven't cooked the recipe. Like, whatever, you know, the robot hasn't cooked the recipe. Like, that's what I think about it. So.
Yeah. Well, and something, I mean, and we're getting off track, but I struggle with is that the daily cooking, which I take great joy in, and, you know, figuring out on the fly what we're going to do with what's around. And, you know, and once you start to develop that, I'm using my air quotes here, into a recipe that's recreatable, everything changes.
Everything changes.
And
everything changes.
There are people, you know, Tamara Alder, someone who does it very well. There are definitely some writers. I think of Ruby Tandow. I mean, there's some people who are doing some amazing stuff on that. But there's more. There's a lot more conversation around that to be had, and for a lot of room, I think, for writers, emerging writers and recipe people to fill up those spaces.
Yes,
I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So your relationship with Instagram and social media in general is, we call it robust. We'll call it. It's an impressive level of engagement, Alicia, that you keep up. And I guess the question is, you know, how important do you see it is to your work? And
I see it as important. I mean, I was a really avid Twitter user until I felt like context collapse was such a constant problem that I just was it was just damaging to my mental health. I have gone back and forth with how important social media is for me or for my work. I've obviously become more of in my Instagram stories, I guess I'm still a lot myself. But in terms of like my feed, it's trying to give a polished presentation of something, but not even that polished, because I'm always trying to leave a little bit of mess in my photos of food. But that's also an aesthetic choice. But for me, I always say, like, I've been on social media for over 20 years. I've been on social media since I was like literally 11 or 12 years old, like on LiveJournal or what. I have been on anything that has come up where I could like talk about myself and learn about other people in a very kind of informal way. Like, I've just been into it since I was a kid. And so for the complication for me has come with professionalizing it, because like for me, there's nothing more natural than to like share my life with people, including strangers. There are strangers, people I've never met, or like maybe I met once at a concert because we followed each other because we like the same band, but we've been following each other's lives for like 25 years, you know, on the internet. And so for me, the tangled thing is that now it's my professional life as well, because it's very easy for me to just be like, whoa, la-di-da, here I am. And also I've become more afraid of being seen and misunderstood. And that's definitely changed how I project myself on social media. I think it's definitely important for keeping myself in people's minds, especially because I'm now, you know, I'm in Puerto Rico most of the time, not in New York most of the time. I don't have face-to-face contact with my colleagues on a regular basis. Like, I'm not keeping myself relevant by like having drinks with people or having lunch or going to events. And so the only way I really know how to maintain some sort of like visibility is just to kind of continue to be available on social media. But it's definitely a complex relationship.
Yeah, complex. But actually gratifying in some ways to hear that you don't hate it necessarily.
I go back and forth.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I've definitely hated it when I've thought too much about it. And like when I get into the metrics, it does make me a bit nuts, because, you know, I have like over 18,000 followers on Instagram, but like how many people are actually seeing my posts? It's like less than half of that. Like if I go look at the insights, I'll get like, but
like 10% or something.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like really upsetting. But at the same time, it's like, you know what? I try and like find my inner LiveJournal child and I just post like her.
Love it.
There's so many. I feel like we could just
chat forever
about some of the stuff that, but we really do, you know, want to focus on this book. And so what you mentioned being on tour, are there things you'll be doing with it?
For the moment, I have a short East Coast tour planned where I'm going to have a big Brooklyn launch So I need to like blow that up because I recently found out the capacity of the space is like 200 people. And so I did myself in there. But ideally, this is coming out later. By the time this comes out, I hope that we'll have organized there being oysters, martinis, wine. Like, it's going to be a big party. So it's not going to just be like I sit and read from a book and have a little conversation. Though I'm going to have a conversation with my good friend Mayuk Sen, the author of Tastemakers.
Great book.
You know, and I'll read something. But at the end of the day, like, that's going to be like 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're just going to drink and eat. And I'm going to bake a sheet cake, which I'm excited about. A couple of sheet cakes.
Yeah, well, you have strong New York roots too.
Yes. I mean, my whole family will be there, so they'll be yelling.
That'll fill up in a second. I love that it's like, a big party, and that you get to read your book. We talked about that before, where cookbook authors don't always
they don't get to read.
Readings.
It's very, very complicated for cookbook authors. But I'll read something and we'll talk. But I'm really excited to just have a party, especially because, you know, I feel like it'll also just be a party for the newsletter. Like, it'll just be like, this is a thing I've been doing for 3 years. I've never had people come together who are into it. I'm excited. I did an event this is like way off topic, but I did an event at the Strand with Tove Danovich about her book Under the Henfluence. And this younger person came and like gave me a handwritten note. And I was like, this is really wild. Very touching, but like, and it also like sort of makes me feel like, okay, like I am doing something. So I'm hoping the tour like makes me feel like I'm not just like a person who sits here in Old San Juan and just like talks at the internet. Because that's what I feel like a lot of the time. So I'm hoping to like actually have human connection on the tour, but I'm only going to be doing New York, Baltimore, DC, and Boston. But they'll all be pretty cool events because Brooklyn, I'm doing the Invisible Dog Art Center with the books sold by Books Are Magic. And then I'm doing Red Emma's in Baltimore, which is a vegetarian like socialist cafe with Crystal Mack, who's an interdisciplinary artist and recipe writer. And then Bold Fork Books in DC, of course, with Rob Rubba, the chef from Oyster. And then in Boston, we haven't decided, but it's going to be at a natural wine bar, a woman-owned natural wine bar. So trying to keep it fun.
Well, and I love hearing all this detail because, one, trying to keep it fun, which you know, we've talked about humor and the importance of that and the element of fun. And, you know, because these are pretty serious topics, but yet you still bring yourself to it. And so much of these events, too, they talk about, and I think other authors can learn from this, that making sure that they match who you are and what you're trying to say. And sometimes I know, you know, I've gotten caught up in planning an event and it's somebody else's idea and I'm just like dreading it. And it's like, okay, why did it's my thing. It's my thing. I should make it mine. So it's really good to hear those details. Yeah. You want to tell people where to find you and how to pre-order your book? I mean, we'll link everything in the show notes, but where's the best place to find you?
To find me, Instagram, Alicia D. Kennedy, and aliciakennedy.substack.com.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. The show is also available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your audio. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thank you, as always, to our editor, Abby Circatella. And until next time, keep on writing, reading, and cooking.